As we said in our last session, following Jesus doesn't always mean we'll be safe, but it does mean that God will protect us, and he will give us that sense of inner peace and that inner security to be able to face whatever we face. Sometimes we'd love God to come through a bit quicker. When our finances are struggling, it would be a lot easier if the finances came through early rather than at the last minute. When the people are unwell and we're praying for healing and healing isn't happening. God, why isn't that happening? So many times when we don't understand. But actually the beauty is that we're called into a relationship with the living God who promises to keep in perfect peace those whose minds are set on him. Do you ever find yourself in those places where you feel caught between a rock and a hard place, where there doesn't seem to be a way out, where actually your future seems really unsafe? For that woman at that moment, caught in adultery and thrust out in public disgrace, public, the stigma, the shame, the exposure of all of that, made her incredibly vulnerable. And her status compared to the religious people, Jesus cuts through all of that and protects this woman from her accusers. Remember that Jesus had been saying to religious leaders that he was the source of living water, and then the leaders had rejected him. And then when they come to trap Jesus, he begins to write in the dirt. Let me read you Jeremiah chapter 17 and verse 13. It says, "Lord, you are the hope of Israel. All who forsake you will be put to shame. Those who turn away from you will be written in the dust, because they have forsaken the Lord, the spring of living water." That's a really interesting verse, because both the religious leaders and Jesus would have been aware of the scriptures. And so Jesus' writing would have been a prophetic act. Sometimes when we're in these situations, doing nothing is probably the best reaction. Sometimes I've found that where I've tried to respond, it's actually made things worse. And sometimes when I don't respond, it actually brings a better result. The Feast of Tabernacles, where they'd pour out the water, Jesus is using that symbology to point towards him. And so when he then writes in the dirt and he does another prophetic act, the religious leaders are sort of drawn to this. And Jesus then says these incredible words, "You who are without sin, throw the first stone." In other words, I'm not going to break the law, but it takes 2 witnesses for that law to be fulfilled, so whoever's perfect can start the process. And then he returns to writing in the dirt. Clearly this is an important symbolic act. He doesn't condone her sin, but he highlights the need for forgiveness and mercy, and reveals that sense of God's heart, that even when we mess up, even when we're going through tough times, when we don't really know what the answer is, God is able to provide us with a way through. He's able to protect us. It's a great promise to know that we have a God who, whatever we face, will protect us and give us that peace and that sense of security, even when we don't feel very safe. God often answers our prayers and brings us through. Those times when he doesn't, the challenge is to realise that doesn't mean that God's not protecting us. Sometimes we don't see the end from the beginning, and God sees the bigger picture. And the challenge for us is, will we choose to trust a God of faith? The woman caught in adultery was vulnerable, exposed, ashamed. She would have stigma. She would be exposed. And Jesus doesn't condemn her in all of her sin and all of her mistakes. He protects her from her accusers and gives her the opportunity to live again and to go on the straight and narrow. And I wonder for us, how do we respond to God? Do we feel confident enough to approach him with things, even when maybe we're unsure? Do we feel that we've got to fix it ourselves, or can we trust that God can do it? Often that's an indication of whether we believe in a God who wants to protect us and keep us as his children.